Greetings, welcome to Lunarburn Studios. In today's video, we're going to talk about an alternative to how to burn out ceramic shell. What do you do if you don't have a kiln? Some of you out there are thinking that it's like, oh, and as I transition from sand casting and want to try ceramic shell, maybe one of the hurdles that you're finding is that, well, I don't want to invest in another piece of equipment if I don't know, how this, literally how this investment our new mold making is going to work for you. So one of the simple things to use to de-wax a ceramic shell is actually a basic hand torch, basic little propane torch. This one actually has a nice trigger on it, so you can just light it when you need it, as opposed to using a striker. And the smaller torches are nice because you can be real specific as you work your way around your ceramic shell. Because one of the key things is you're going to want to get the cup and the gate and the vent out before you overheat your pattern. Because as we know, really the trick is getting the pattern wax out of the investment before the wax has a chance to expand and crack your shell. So another way to go about it is to use a little bit bigger torch. This is just a basic weed burner, still a propane torch. The nice thing about this torch is that there's a trigger, which I don't know how we want to refer to it as an afterburner, or basically puts it up to full throttle. And then there's a knob here to control. It's really just meant as the pilot for the torch. But what we'll use it for is actually to feather back, get ourselves a nice consistent flame. Because realistically, if we just jam on this hardcore, more than likely we're just going to break our shell. Or you're just throwing too much heat everywhere except for where you really need it. So ideally what we'll do is we'll dial back to a flame that's a little bit more controlled until we get our cup and our gate out of the way. Then we'll go ahead and engage the hotter flame to really flush out the wax, and then hopefully maybe even take it up to a vitrification temperature. Now really where this method comes into play is we can really de-wax our shells this way, but realistically you're still going to need a way to vitrify your shells. And you can do that maybe with the torch, and we'll see how that goes today, but as well, or putting it into your preheat. And because you do need to heat up your shells before you actually pour metal into them. You can't pour them cold like you do sand casting. And then the other option is to utilize what you have. So I'm assuming that if you're playing with ceramic shell, that you have a way of melting your metal, more than likely in a gas forge or a gas furnace of some sort. So you could do it that way. And so depending on how big your shell is and how big your furnace is, you could actually, before you melt the metal, stick your ceramic shell into your furnace and melt and vitrify your shells that way. And what I mean by vitrify is that you're basically, as far as like ceramic terms, you're hardening the shell, or basically bisque firing the material to make it harder. So in ceramics we call it bisque firing. In this case we're going to use more of the technical term and just refer to as vitrification of the ceramic shell. Ultimately, a third way to vitrify once we de-wax would be to stick it into an electric kiln, but you need to be careful because ultimately there potentially is going to be some wax residue in here, and if your electric kiln is staged inside your basement or your garage, you could wind up having a fair bit of off-gassing and creating some other issues in that environment. So if you do your electric kiln, make sure your electric kiln has adequate ventilation. Ideally is in an outdoor situation on a back porch or in an open garage or something along those lines. So one of our goals today is we're going to ultimately kind of play and experiment a little bit. The shell we're going to be burning out are these, the same kind of skull pattern that I've been using for all my demos up to this point. And so the key thing is, like I said, to get the gate, the cup, and the vent out before, in a timely fashion, but also to try to maybe hold off on some of the heat that's going to come off around the shell. We need to get these elements out of the way first before we really attack and try to get the pattern wax out. If we just throw all of our heat up here to the main pattern, I'll guarantee you that the shell is going to crack because the wax doesn't have anywhere to go and it will expand. On this first attempt, I'm going to try to burn out the shell with no alterations to the shell itself. So we've cut off the cup. Obviously, from my previous videos, I like to use styrofoam cups coated in wax for my pour cups. And typically, this in the regular burnout kiln, the styrofoam just vaporizes real instantly. I don't really have to think about it. In this situation, I don't necessarily want to get the flame up into the cup prematurely. It's going to be hard to get it because I'm just going to set it here and try to get the flame up and around it. So what I'm going to do with this long ass screwdriver is try to get some of that styrofoam out, at least off the bottom of the cup. So as soon as I start melting this wax on the gate, it's going to start evacuating. Move some of this stuff out of the way, and I'll just throw the styrofoam in a pocket for now. I don't want it just blowing around out in the courtyard. Usually, I guess I really don't have to think about it because usually I just vaporize the crap out of it. The first attempt will just be attacking this as is and seeing how aggressive and how quickly we can get the wax out of this shell. I'm going to try to keep the heat relatively low in the cup and the vent and work our way up. And well, we're going to see what happens. See whether I just blow up the shell, whether it can actually handle it. When I use the hand torch, the limitation is I can get the wax out of the shell, but I can't get the shell as a volume up to vitrification temperatures. I really need either a contained environment, and that means either once I get the wax out of this, either sticking it into an electric kiln, or you could even stick it in your furnace, depending on the size of the shell and the size of your furnace. You could actually bisque fire or vitrify your shells that way. But what I'm thinking is with this torch, that because it'll give me such a broad flame, that maybe I can actually bring it up to vitrification temperatures once I drop all the wax out, and without the need of a kiln whatsoever. Will it work? I don't know. We're going to find out. And with that said, let's get started. Well, now we can actually see the wax is really starting to melt out of this and dropping into the pan, and definitely not using the afterburner. And of course, not the afterburner that's on my kiln, but the trigger on this weed burner to kick it into high gear. So as we're moving around, we can tell that the surface is starting to, char and collect carbon on it as it's getting darker. But what we'll do is we just want to evenly keep moving around the surface from side to side. And then I'm just going to keep moving over the surface, and so now what I'm trying to do is, it looks like the bulk of the wax is dropped out of the shell. So let me, drag this, the pan out of the way so we don't, inadvertently ignite that. And now I'm going to really crank up the torch using that extra trigger, and really kind of, to throw some, some substantial BTUs at the shell. So that wasn't too bad. It took about 30 minutes. Took a little bit of playing around with the Harbor Freight weed burner. Ultimately, full bore was a little bit too much too quickly. And evidence is that it set my existing wax on fire in the pan. So once I got that swapped out, throttled down the burner a little bit, Was able to go at it a little bit more controlled, going around the cup, the gate, and the vent, getting those areas out. In the end, I was probably a little bit too aggressive by evidence of the crack that formed up this outside. But it's super manageable. It's, it's essentially a hairline crack that will be easily patchable and really won't affect the bronze or the whatever metal we pour into this too drastically. There will be some evidence, but at least the crack happened out here along the outside of the cranium, where it'll be the easiest area to chase, as opposed to a crack across the face, across the teeth, and some of the other more detailed areas. Now, one of the things that's a challenge, that's evident in this process is that this piece actually really facilitated being able to burn it out this way. I was able to drop the wax out, but it's like, because it's direct sprued, I was able to evacuate the gating system pretty easily before attacking the pattern. Now, if you're doing something that's a little bit more indirect or just complicated in nature or even sizable, you're going to want to be a little more strategic in how you move around the form with your torch. And it might well be better off using, the smaller hand torch to have that kind of control, as opposed to just blasting the crap out of it with the weed burner. So I'm not saying that you can burn out all your shells this way, but if you're just starting out and you need a way to kind of play to see if this process is viable before you have a chance to actually build some sort of burnout situation, some sort of option, or if you're in a pinch out in the field and you just need to burn out a shell, I think this process is valid, but you are using a lot more fuel because we don't have any way to contain that heat. So, there's different trade-offs. Each process, each process has its trade-offs, its pros, its cons, and it just depends on what your situation is at that time and with equipment at hand. But ultimately, not having a burnout kiln is not a limitation to being able to not try ceramic shell. We want to try this again. Now, to potentially eliminate this crack, what we're going to do with this next shell is we're going to put in what's called a microvent. Using a masonry bit on your hand drill. In this case, it's about a 3/8 inch masonry bit. Typically, I would drill the holes between 3/8 and maybe a quarter. No smaller, no bigger than this. And what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to drill right into the pattern, but I'm going to drill a hole right above where the gate hits the pattern. And then that way, if and when this starts heating up, it actually has an escape route and is not dependent on waiting for the rest of the gated and cut material to evacuate. And hopefully that will be enough to release to keep us from actually cracking our shell. The reason why we want to be, one of the nice things about the microventing is that you can choose. Yes, you're going to have to patch that hole before we pour metal into it, but at least we're making that choice on where that crack is. We got lucky on the first one that the crack was up over the back of the skull, and either way it will be an easy area to chase. What we don't want are cracks and stuff to come down, say, over the teeth and the nose in this pattern particularly, because that's where all of our detail is. So it's better to be preemptive and decide what areas you need to fix and patch and correct than to have some, chaos and randomness affecting your casting. To do the microvent, I want to be careful. I don't want to just plunge it all the way through, but I'm going to go up here right at the top of the gate, but right below the pattern. And I'm going to go in just far enough until I start seeing wax peeling up on my drill bit. And so realistically, that's going to be enough to create some extra drainage to keep this from happening. Now, just to get a better shot of drilling the microvent, I think realistically one hole is going to be enough on this, but we're going to drill 2 just to cover our bases. You don't need to be hot, crazy with it. And again, just enough to get until I get a nice peel of wax out here, indicating that I made it through that first layer of shell. And that should be enough. With a nice clean masonry bit, it goes through this unvitrified shell really easily. Okay, so to get my desired flame, see if I pull the trigger, I'm getting full on gas and it's just going to be a big roar. But ultimately what I want to do is I want to control this. I don't want to just go super crazy and crack the shell like I did the last time. So ideally, typically for this would just be your pilot. And then when you need the flame, that you get some hardcore flame. But in this situation, that's just too much too quickly in this situation. So we're gonna turn up the flame, get rid of that yellow. So it's a nice healthy flame, but we have not quite as intense compared to the full flame. Okay, so there you go. That actually turned out pretty well. The relief holes definitely made a difference. Obviously was able to, get the wax out from down below before attacking the pattern. That whole sequence took about a half an hour. And so far, on close inspection, just initial inspection, it looks like we have a pretty solid shell. Let's see here if there's, and obviously we got all the carbon off, but we have a nice, relatively nice tone to it. So I think we got, pretty close to vitrification. And what little bit of the shell maybe didn't vitrify, we'll certainly be able to do that during the preheat. Now you might be asking, why not always burn your shells out this way? Why need a kiln? Well, ultimately a kiln is going to give you super consistency, or a lot better consistency. And whereas it looks like, at least initially, that I have a pretty good burn on this shell, 9 out of 10 times if you do this technique, you're probably going to crack your shell. And so, that would certainly be the argument for actually having a burnout kiln or some sort of, a better situation to more consistently burn out your shells. But like I said in the beginning, if you're in a situation where you just want to try this out, you're getting, some, just dip or suspended slurry, or you score slurry from someplace else, and you're just trying to give it a try without investing into a larger kiln or just another piece of equipment, then this is a valid way to kind of jump into it. Where this is also nice is that, sometimes I'll take my bigger kiln that's behind me out on the road with me, but realistically, if I'm out at an iron pour or just a different foundry, or just something where I have a shell with me that needs to get burned out and I don't have a kiln, doesn't mean I can't pour my shells, can't pour my molds. So this is definitely a valid technique. For every shortcut, there's a price. And the price on this technique is that it's a little slower, you eat up a good bit more gas, and then ultimately, like I said, probably easily 9 out of 10 times, more than likely, you're going to crack your shell. But typically the cracks I do get, if I do get them on these, this type of burnout, is that they're pretty super tight and subtle, to a point where they'll, yes, they need to be patched before the pour, but they won't necessarily create defects on my metal in such a drastic way that needs to be severely, needs a lot of patchwork and or needs a lot of grinding and chasing work in the metal later on. So quick and dirty, propane torch, hand torch, be slow, be methodical. Obviously it generates a fair bit of carbon. You wind up, you do save some wax, but you obviously do burn off a fair bit of wax. So you want to, it's not the most efficient way of doing it, but it is a very doable way of burning out your shells. I hope you found that, I hope you found this process helpful. If nothing else, just knowing what's going on inside the kiln as you're actually de-waxing a shell, instead of just closing the lid, pulling it out and seeing what happens. And getting a sense of like how the wax is melting out of the shell, how the carbon's burning off, at what point are you actually done, cleaning out your shell and ready for either vitrification and or preheat and prep. So, and as always, hit the like button if you found something helpful in this video. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so already, if you're really kind of digging my content and want to see more. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And until then, be creative and be safe.